Witold's report from Auschwitz. So I am to write down, if possible, plain facts, as my colleagues want me to. I have been told the more you stick to plain facts, with no superfluous commentary, the more valuable they will be. And so I shall try. But a man is not made of wood, let alone stone, although at times even a stone might break out in a cold sweat at what I shall relate. So sometimes, in between facts, I'm going to throw in a reflection expressing my feelings. I am not sure if this will necessarily diminish the value of my writings. I was not made of stone, although I envied stone many times. I still had a heart, sometimes rising to beat right up in my throat, a thought fluttering somewhere in my head. I guess sometimes I managed to catch it with difficulties. All that altogether, with some side remarks from time to time, will convey a faithful picture of what this report seeks to describe. September 19th, 1940. The 2nd Street Roundup of civilians in Warsaw. There are still some people alive who saw me walk up at 6 a.m. and stand among the fives assembled by the SS at the corner of Wojska Polskiego Avenue and Felińskiego Street. We were then loaded into trucks at Plac Wilsona and driven to the Szwoleżerów barracks. After registration in a makeshift office and having any sharp objects we happened to have on us confiscated, under threat of being shot on the spot if even a blade was found later on, we were led out into the riding hall where we remained. September 19th and 20th. During these few days, some of us got acquainted with the rubber baton which would come down on our heads. However, this was more or less within acceptable bounds for those accustomed to guardians of the peace using such methods to keep order. Meanwhile, some families bought out their relatives large wads of cash paid to the SS. At night, we slept side by side on the ground. The riding hall was illuminated by a giant searchlight, which stood right next to the entrance. On all four sides, SS men with machine guns stood watch over us. There were 1,800 of us, or more. What annoyed me most was how passive all the Poles were. It was as if the captured were afflicted by a collective psychosis which turned them into a herd of sheep. I was tempted by a simple idea, to stir their minds, to rally this crowd and spur it into action. I even suggested a joint night action to a comrade of mine, Sławek Szpakowski. I know that he lived in Warsaw until the uprising. We would take control of the crowd and launch an assault against the sentry posts. On my way to the lavatory, I thought I could bump into the searchlight and smash it. But then again, I joined this group for a different reason. Settling for this plan would mean settling for a much lesser cause. Sławek thought this was all pure and complete fantasy. In the morning of September 21st, we were packed tight onto trucks and escorted by motorcycles with mounted machine guns delivered to Dworzec Zachodni and loaded into goods wagons. These wagons must have been carrying lime beforehand, for the entire floor was covered in it. The wagons were slammed shut. We traveled the whole day with nothing to eat or drink. Not that anybody wanted to anyway. We had some bread from the day before, bread that we were not able to eat nor appreciate at the time. We were just very thirsty. The wagons shook so much that the lime gradually turned into fine dust, became airborne and irritated our nostrils and throats. They gave us nothing to drink. Through the gasps in the planks boarding up the windows, we could see that we were going somewhere towards Częstochowa. Around 10 p.m., the train came to halt. We heard shouts, screams, and dogs howling as the wagons were opened. In my recollections, I have arrived at a point which marks the moment when I left behind all earthly things and stepped into somewhere beyond it. I am not trying to be fancy, quite the opposite. I see no need to use any sophisticated, albeit irrelevant words. This is exactly how it was. The blows to our heads were not just the doing of the SS rifle butts, it was something else, something more. All our earthly notions, the established order of things, the law, took a brutal kicking too. Everything fell apart. They tried to strike us with all their strength, to break us mentally as fast as possible. A tumultuous clamor of voices was gradually approaching. Suddenly, the door of the wagon flew open. We stood blinded by the searchlight. Heraus! Raus! Raus! They were hollering. Blows by SS rifle butts rained down on our arms, backs, heads. We had to get out quickly. I jumped, and surprisingly avoided getting hit. When we were being arranged into rows 5 abreast, simply called fives, I found myself in the middle of the column. A larger gang of SS men was hitting, kicking, and hollering at the top of their lungs, "Zu fünfe!" Those on the outside of the fives had it worst. Savaged by dogs and taunted by the soldiers, blinded by the spotlights, shoved, kicked, hit, savaged by the dogs. We found ourselves under conditions unlike anything any of us had ever experienced. The weaker ones were dazed to such an extent that they literally formed a mindless mass. We were rushed towards a brightly lit area. On the way, one of us was told to run to the side of the road towards a pole, just to be followed by a swift round of fire from an SMG. Killed. A random 10 were pulled out and shot as part of a collective punishment for the escape, which was arranged by the SS men. All 11 corpses were dragged away, pulled by straps tied to their legs. The dogs were set loose on the bloodied corpses. All of that was accompanied by laughter and mockery. We approached a wire fence with a sign above it that read, "Arbeit macht frei." It was not until later that we learned the meaning of that inscription. Behind the fence, there were rows of brick buildings and a large square. When walking between the rows of SS men, before the very gate, we found a moment of respite. The dogs were chased away, and we were ordered to align our fives. They counted us meticulously, adding the corpses to the total number. The high, at the time single, barbed wire fence and the gate full of SS men, for some reason, brought to my mind a Chinese proverb that I had read some time in the past. When entering, think of retreat, and you shall leave safe and sound. I could not help an ironic smirk which faded away. What good would that do here? Behind the fence, in the square, we were struck by a different view. In a somewhat supernatural light crawling upon us from everywhere, we saw some beings that seemed quasi-human. Their behavior was more like that of wild animals. Nay, this is offense to animals here. There is no words for creatures like that in our language, at least not yet. In bizarre striped outfits like the ones in the movies about Sing Sing, with medals on colorful ribbons. That is what I thought they were in the flickering light. With clubs in their hands, they jumped onto some of us, laughing hysterically, hitting people on their heads, kicking in the kidneys and other vulnerable places. Those who were already lying on the ground, jumping on people's chests and stomachs. They were inflicting death with most uncanny relish. So they locked us up in a lunatic asylum. A thought raced through my mind. Such wickedness. I was still thinking in human categories. We were people from the street roundup, and so, even in the eyes of the Germans, guilty or no crime against the Third Reich. The words that Jan Wodarkiewicz spoke to me after the first street roundup in August in Warsaw flashed through my mind. So you see, you failed to make use of such a great opportunity. People caught in a street are not going to face political charges. That is the safest way into the camp. How naive! Back then in Warsaw, when thinking about those Poles who had already been taken to such camps. Here, you did not need a political reason to get yourself killed. Any unlucky fellow could get killed any time. For starters, the striped fellow with the club would ask, "Was bist du von Zivil?" Answering anything like priest, judge, lawyer at the time got you beaten and killed. Standing before me in my five was a man who, grabbed by the throat, answered, "Richter." A dreadful idea. A moment later, he was on the ground, beaten and kicked. So they were intentionally eradicating the intelligentsia. When I realized that, I modified my attitude somewhat. These were not madmen. They were some monstrous tool for murdering the Poles, starting with the intelligentsia. The thirst was unbearable. They had brought in pots with something to drink. Our killers now brought us mugs with this drink and asked, "Was bist du von Zivil?" They would hand us the coveted drink, coveted because it was wet substance, provided we answered that we were workers or craftsmen. They beat us and kicked us, shouting, "Hier ist KL Auschwitz, mein lieber Mann." We were wondering, what was that supposed to mean? Some of us knew that it meant Oświęcim, although all it meant to us was the name of a Polish town. The dreadful notoriety of the camp was not yet to reach Warsaw, and the world did not learn that name until later. It was not until later that this word curdled the blood of free men and came to haunt the prisoners of Pawiak, Montelupich, Wiśnicz, and Lublin. One of the inmates explained to us that we were in the former barracks of the 5th Horse Artillery Battalion, DAK, near the town of Oświęcim. We learned that we were a Zugang of Polish bandits who had been harassing the peaceful German population, and that we were waiting for a fitting punishment. Zugang referred to all arrivals to the camp, every new transport. In the meantime, they started a roll call by shouting out the names that we had given back in Warsaw, and we had to reply quickly and loudly, "Here." There were plenty of opportunities for harassment and persecution on such occasions. After the roll call, we were sent by the hundreds of euphemistically called bath. This was how transports of people captured in the streets of Warsaw and allegedly to be sent to Germany to work were taken in. This was how every transport in the first months of establishing the Auschwitz camp, June 14th, 1940, was received. Out of the darkness, from somewhere above, from above the kitchen, the executioner, Siedler, Fritz Siedler, would speak. "None of you should hope to get out of this place alive. The rations are calculated for you to survive for 6 weeks. If you live longer, it means you steal. And if you steal, you will be put in the SK, where you won't stay alive for long." This was translated into Polish by Władysław Baworowski, the camp interpreter. The goal was to break us psychologically as quickly as possible. We deposited all the bread that we had in our possession onto the wheelbarrows and rollwaga and were brought to the square. No one regretted it back then. No one was thinking about food. How often later on, just the very thought of that moment drove us into a rage and made our mouths water. Several wheelbarrows and a pushcart full of bread. What a pity! We could not fill ourselves in advance. Along with 100 others, I found myself finally in front of the Baderaum, Block 18, according to the old numbering. We deposited everything into large sacks to which our respective prisoner numbers were tied. They shaved our heads and bodies, but we were merely sprinkled with tepid water. It was here that I had my first 2 teeth knocked out, the reason being that I was carrying the registration number in my hand instead of carrying it in my teeth, as the Badermeister happened to wish that day. I got hit in the jaw with a heavy rod. I spat out 2 teeth. There was a little blood. Harassment. From that moment on, we became mere numbers. The official name was Schutzhäftling, number so-and-so. My number was 4,859. 2 13s. To sum up the 2 digits in the middle and the 2 on the outside, had my comrades convinced of my impending demise. I, however, was glad that I had them. We were given blue and white striped uniforms made of denim, just like the ones that had us so shocked at night. It was already morning, September 22nd, 1940. Many things have lost theirs imaginary appearance from the night time. The semi-humans wore yellow armbands with black letters reading capo on their left arms, and instead of colorful ribbons with medals as we had thought at night in the flickering light, they had colorful triangles, a winkel, on the left side of their chests and below the triangle, as if under the ribbon a small black number on the white patch. The winkels came in 5 colors. Political offenders wore red, criminals green, those who disdained working in the Third Reich black, the Bible students purple, homosexuals pink. We, the Poles, caught in the streets of Warsaw, supposedly meant to work in Germany, were assigned red winkels as political offenders. I must admit that of all the colors, that one suited me best. Dressed up in striped denim uniforms with neither caps nor socks, I was given socks on December 8th and a cap on December 15th. In wooden clogs falling off our feet, we were led out into the so-called roll call square and divided into 2 groups. Some of us went to Block 10, while others, us, to Block 17, to the upper floor. The Häftlinge were accommodated both on the ground and upper floors of each block. They had separate commercial and administrative staffs amounting to a separate block. To help distinguish them, all blocks on the upper floors had the letter A added to their numbers. And so we were taken to Block 17A and handed over to the blockman, Alois, who later became known as Krwawy Alois, Bloody Alois, Alois Stahler. He was a German communist with a red winkel, a degenerate, who by then had spent about 6 years in camps. He single-handedly would beat, torment, torture, and kill several people a day. He took delight in imposing order and military drill, adjusting the rows on the square by swinging his club. Our block, arranged in 10 rows, adjusted by Alois, who would run in between the rows with an enormous club, was a paragon of military parade alignment. Now, in the morning, he was strutting amongst the rows for the first time. He was turning us Zugangs into the new block. He peered into our strange faces, looking for people fit for maintaining order in the block. Fate decreed that he chose me, Karol Świętorzecki, a reserve officer of the 13th Lancers Regiment, Witold Różycki, not the infamous one. This Różycki was a decent man from Władysława Street in Warsaw, and a couple of others. Having quickly led us into the block to the upper floor, he ordered us to form a row against the wall, turn around, and bend over. He dished each one of us 5 hefty blows at full strength in a spot allegedly designed for that purpose. You had to clench your teeth and suppress any inclination to groan. The test turned out, I think, rather well, so that you know the taste of it, and so that you know how to use it while caring for the block's cleanliness and order. This is how I became a Stubendienst, but not for long. Even though we maintained exemplary order and cleanliness in the block, Alois did not like the methods we employed to achieve them. Having warned us a couple of times, both personally and through Kazik, identity unknown, Alois's henchman, to no avail, he flew into a rage and threw us out into the camp, exposed to the elements, for 3 days, saying, "So you may have a taste of the work in the lager, and appreciate the roof over your heads and the peace you have here in the block." I had noticed that less and less people were coming back from work each day. I knew that they were done in by one or other kind of work, but it was not until now that I had the opportunity to get first-hand experience of a regular prisoner's day of labor. And everyone had to work. Only the room foremen were allowed to stay in the block. We all slept on the ground strewn with straw-filled mattresses. During the first period, we had no beds at all. The gong marked the start of each day. In the summer, at 4:20 a.m., in the winter, at 5:20 a.m. At that sound, which was irrevocable order, we had to spring to our feet. We had to fold our blankets quickly, meticulously adjusting the edges. The straw-filled mattresses had to be carried to one end of the hall, where the mattress men collected them in order to stack them into a pile. The blanket had to be returned to the blanket man upon leaving the hall. We finished dressing already in the hallway. Everything was done hastily, in a rush, as bloody Alois would burst into the hall, wielding a rod and shouting, "Fenster auf!" Also, you had to hurry to stand in a long line to use the lavatory. During the first period, there were no lavatories in the blocks. In the morning, we had to run to several latrines where very long queues were formed, sometimes 100 or 200 men. There were not enough seats inside. A capo armed with the usual rod would count to 5. Whoever failed to finish his business at the count of 5 received blows to the head. Many fell into the hole. From the latrines, we would rush to the few pumps available in the square. There were no washraums in the blocks during that first period. Several thousand people were supposed to wash there. It was impossible, naturally. You broke through to the pump and drew some water into your billy can. Your feet had to be clean for the night, though. During the evening inspections, when the room foreman would make their quantity reports on the prisoners lying on the straw-filled mattresses, the blockman would simultaneously check the cleanliness of our feet. We had to put our feet out from under the blankets to make our soles visible. If the foot was not clean enough, or the blockman deemed it to be insufficiently so, the offender was seated on a stool and administered 10 to 20 blows with a rod. This was one more way designed to eliminate inmates under the guise of caring for hygiene. The same applied to doing unspeakable damage to the bodies of the prisoners in latrines by forcing bodily functions on account of 5, as well as the nerve-wracking struggle at the pumps. Indeed, the continuous rush and Laufschritt applied everywhere during the first period of the camp. From the pumps, everyone rushed to the side for the so-called coffee or tea. The hot liquid delivered to the halls in pots was a rather weak imitation of these beverages. A regular inmate never saw sugar. I noticed that some of the inmates who had been here for several months had swollen legs and faces. Physicians whom I asked about that said the swelling was due to excessive liquid intake. Either the kidneys or the heart would begin to fail, an enormous effort of the body, coupled with the consumption of almost everything in liquid form, coffee, tea, avo, and soup. I resolved to give up liquids that were not giving me any benefits and stick to avo and soups. Generally, you had to keep your whims and desires firmly in check. Some of us refused to give up hot liquids due to the cold. Things were even worse when it came to smoking, because during the first period, prisoners had no money, as they were not allowed to write home at first. We had to wait a long time for that, and it took about 3 months for the reply to arrive. Whoever was unable to control himself and traded bread for cigarettes was digging his own grave. I knew a good deal of people like that, and they all brought their demise upon themselves. There were no graves. All the corpses were burnt in the newly built crematorium. Therefore, I was in no rush for the hot slurry, while others were pushing and shoving and getting themselves beaten up and kicked in the process. If a prisoner with swollen legs grabbed opportunity to get better work and better food, he would recover. The swelling would go down, but irritating ulcers would form instead, oozing foul fluid and sometimes phlegm, which was something I had never seen until then. By avoiding liquids, I fortunately managed to save myself from that. Even before everyone managed to get the hot slurry, the room foreman was already emptying the hall with the help of his club, as the hall had to be cleaned before the roll call. In the meantime, straw mattresses and blankets were arranged according to the fashion in the block, and the blocks competed against one another in arranging the bed linen. The floor had to be washed as well. The gong for the morning roll call sounded at 5:45 a.m. At 6 a.m., everyone was standing in aligned rows. Each block formed 10 rows, which made counting easier. Everyone had to be present at the roll call. If someone happened to be missing, not because he escaped, but for example, Some new arrival naively hid away or simply had overslept, and the numbers at the roll call did not tally. Such a person was found, dragged out into the square, and almost always publicly killed. Sometimes the absentee was a prisoner who had hanged himself somewhere in the attic, or went for the wires precisely at that time of the roll call. In such cases, we heard gunshots from the watchtower and saw the prisoner fall, riddled with bullets. Prisoners went for the wires, mostly in the morning, before a new day of the ordeal began. It happened less often before nighttime, because it was a few hour respite from the torture. There was an official order which prohibited prisoners from preventing their fellow inmates from committing suicide. Those who were caught trying to prevent their fellow prisoners from committing suicide were sent to the bunker as punishment. All authorities inside the camp consisted exclusively of prisoners. Initially, they were Germans, but later on, other nationalities started to find their way into it. The blockmen, wearing a red armband with white letters reading Blockaltester on their right arm, would finish off prisoners with rigor and rod. They were responsible for the block, but had nothing to do with the prisoner's labor schedule. A capo, on the other hand, would finish off prisoners with labor and rod in a commando, a work unit, and would be responsible for a given commando's work. The supreme authority of the camp was the so-called Lageraltester. In the beginning, there were two of them, Bruno Brodzniewicz, and Leon Wieczorek, both prisoners. Two thugs who made everyone freeze in fear, murdering in full view of the audience, sometimes with just one strike of a club or fist. The true name of the former was Bronisław Brodniewicz, the latter Leon Wieczorek, ex-Poles in German servitude. Dressed differently to everybody else, in high boots, navy blue trousers, jackets and berets, with black armbands with white letters on their left arms, they made a somber pair, often seen together. But all these auxiliary camp authorities, recruited from people from behind the wires, bow in front of every single SS man, not daring to reply to their questions until they took off their caps and stood at attention. An ordinary prisoner truly amounted to nothing. The official authorities, formed of superior men, Übermenschen, as they called themselves, in military uniforms, namely the SS members, lived outside the camp's perimeter, in barracks and in the town. I will now go back to describing the camp's daily schedule. The roll call. We were standing in rows, as straight as a wall. I had actually missed well-aligned rows since the war in 1939, aligned with the help of a rod. We were mesmerized by the abhorrent scene that unfolded before us. The rows from Block 13, according to the old numbering, the SK, Strafkompanie, were aligned to the blockman, Krankenmann, Ernst Krankenmann, in a radical manner, with a knife. At that time, all the Jews, priests, and some of the Poles, with Proven and fractions, were sent to the SK. Krankenmann's duty was to finish off the prisoners who were sent to him almost on a daily basis, as quickly as it was possible. This duty was well suited to the man's character. If anyone, by any chance, happened to lean forward a couple of centimeters too much, Krankenmann would stab him in the belly with a knife he kept up his right sleeve. Those who moved back too much due to excessive caution were stabbed in the kidneys by the butcher as he ran through the lines. The view of a collapsing man kicking out his legs and moaning was enough to evoke Krankenmann's wrath. He would jump on the man's chest, kick him in the kidneys, genitals, trying to finish him off as soon as possible, and to silence him. Sights like these were enough to make us tremble as if electrocuted. Back then, I had one thought as I stood side by side with my fellow Poles. We were all united by the same wrath, with a desire for revenge. I felt that I was in an environment perfectly suited for getting on with my task, and I discovered a small glimmer of joy inside me. A moment later, however, I became frightened of losing my mind. Joy? Here? That had to be madness. And yet, it was joy that I felt. Mostly because I wanted to start my task, and so I did not break down. This was a psychological turning point for me. In all illness, one could perhaps say that the crisis had been averted. For now, however, I had to fight for my life with a great deal of effort. The gong after the roll call meant Arbeitskommando formieren. Upon that signal, everyone ran to the formed commandos, work units, whichever they thought were better. Back then, there was still some chaos with the assignments, unlike later on when everyone calmly approached the commando to which he was assigned as a number. The prisoners were running in all directions, crossing each other's paths. All the while, capos, blockmen, and SS men took advantage of that, trying to trip them up, shove them, hit those who were running or falling with their rods, always kicking where it hurt the most. During those 3 days, which I was to spend in the camp, expelled by Alois as a punishment, I was working with the wheelbarrows carrying gravel. Simply not knowing where to stand and not having any particular commando in mind, I stood in one of 5s in the 100 that was chosen for that work. It consisted mostly of fellow inmates from Warsaw, numbers older than us, which meant people who had been imprisoned before us. Those who somehow managed to survive had already taken some of the more comfortable jobs. We, inmates from Warsaw, were being decimated with various kinds of labor, sometimes forced to carry gravel from one pit to another and then back again. I found myself among those carrying gravel for the construction of the crematorium. We were building the crematorium for ourselves. The scaffolding around the chimney was rising higher and higher, with a wheelbarrow filled by Vorarbeiters, toadies with no compassions for us. One had to move quickly, and while moving over wooden boards laid further on, run with the wheelbarrow. Every 15 to 20 steps there was a capo with a rod hitting passers-by, shouting, "Laufschritt." You pushed the wheelbarrows up slowly. With an empty wheelbarrow, Laufschritt was obligatory for the entire length of the route. Muscles, eyes, and wits competed against one another in the struggle for survival. You had to have a lot of strength to pull the wheelbarrow, to keep it from falling off the plank. You had to spot and use a opportune moment to take a breather and catch second wind. This is where I saw how many of us, members of the intelligentsia, failed those harsh, unforgiving conditions. Yes, it was tough selection we had been going through back then. My past interests in sports and gymnastics turned out to be hugely beneficial for me at that point. Educated middle-class person looking around helplessly or expecting help for having been a lawyer or engineer was always treated with a hard rod. Here, a pot-bellied lawyer or landowner ineptly trying to push the wheelbarrow would fall off the plank into the sand, unable to get it back on the track. There, a helpless professor in his glasses or an elderly gentleman would paint an equally pathetic picture. All those fit for labor, or those not used to running with a wheelbarrow, were beaten. And if they happened to fall while pushing the wheelbarrows, killed by blows from a rod or a boot. It was at moments like these, taking advantage of another prisoner's death, you stood there like an animal, trying to catch some breath, fill your overworked lungs to calm the rhythm of a fast-beating heart. Luckily, we were not expected to pass by our predecessors under this order of the Third Reich. The gong for lunch, which I think was welcomed with joy by everyone in the camp, would sound at 11:20 a.m. Between 11:30 a.m. and noon, a roll call would take place, usually pretty quickly, and from 12 p.m. to 1 p.m., it was time for lunch. After lunch, another gong would tell us to return to our Arbeitskommandos, and further torture would commence until the gong signaling the evening roll call. I was working with the wheelbarrows for 3 days. On the third day, after lunch, it seemed to me that I would never make it to the next gong. I was already exhausted, and I understood that once there's no one else weaker than me left for killing, it would be my turn to die. Bloody Alois, who was fond of supervising our work in the block as far as orderliness and tidiness were concerned, graciously took us back to the block after these 3 penal days out in the open, saying, "Now you know what work out in the camp means. Passt auf, work in the block, lest I throw you outdoors for good." As far as I was concerned, he carried out this threat pretty quickly. I did not apply the methods he required and which Kazik, identity unknown, advised me to use against the inmates, and I was thrown out of the block with a bang, which I will describe below.